Welcome to RuralStrong, where we talk real challenges and bold solutions in rural economic development. I'm your host, Joe Barker. Let's get into it. Welcome to RuralStrong. Today's podcast comes to you from the Southwest Tennessee Development District podcast studio in beautiful downtown Jackson, Tennessee. This is the podcast that brings you strategies, best practices, and real success stories in rural economic and community development. And we've got a very special guest today. You know, in sports, you hear of the GOAT. Well, we've got a GOAT in West Tennessee, and not only West Tennessee, really throughout the Southeast, that has years of experience in economic and community development. And he's unique. He's been on the statewide level. He's been in an urban area in Memphis, and he's worked in the rural area. And, of course, primarily what we're going to talk about today is his efforts in the rural area to land the largest investment in the state of Tennessee in a rural area in West Tennessee. But I do want to give you a little background on Mark. Mark Herbison has more than 30 years of economic development and governmental experience with an emphasis on business recruitment, retention, and expansion programs. Early in his career, Mark served as a statewide radio news reporter in Nashville with the Tennessee Radio Network. After leaving radio, Mark served for nearly 10 years in various roles with the Tennessee Secretary of State's office in Nashville, including Public Information Officer, Assistant Director of Publications, and as Administrative Assistant to the Secretary of State. In 1998, Mark returned to his hometown of Paris, Henry County, Tennessee, to fill the roles of Director of Economic Development. Since then, Herbison has served as an automotive recruitment consultant at the Tennessee Department of Economic and Community Development, as Director of Economic Development at the Nashville Chamber of Commerce, as Vice President of Economic Development at the Rutherford County Chamber of Commerce, and served for over 13 years as the Senior Vice President of Economic Development for the Greater Memphis Chamber. Prior to his current role as President of the newly formed Tipton County Community Development Council, Mark served as President of HTL Advantage, a three-county industrial development agency serving Haywood, Tipton, and Lauderdale counties in West Tennessee. HTL was the agency responsible for the local level recruitment of Ford Blue Oval City in West Tennessee. Mark, great to have you with us.
Good morning, Joe. It's so glad to be with you. And I've been compared to a goat, but it had to do with my smell.
Well, we're not going to bring that up, but we'll talk about the real goat and the process that you have to go through to actually have something to sell. And we all know in rural communities that's very difficult. And in the podcast today, in this session, we want to talk primarily about the cooperative effort and the collaboration between local elected officials, state officials, to come up with what we call a mega site in West Tennessee. And I know we've got listeners from all across the country, so the first thing let's do is explain exactly what a mega site is.
Well, a mega site, back when they started the program, was a site considered, a very large site, over 1,000 acres. And so back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, we were seeing big mega projects. We'd really never seen those before. Most, if you had a 50-acre or 100-acre project, that was a pretty big project. But we saw a lot of companies around the country building these mega facilities, and TVA was noticing that they were kind of getting beat on those big projects. And so in the early 2000s, they came up with the mega site program. And that was an endeavor to go out and look around their 7-state territory at potential mega site locations. And so that's how this all started back in the early 2000s, Joe. And you know as well as I do from your time as a county mayor and your time at state economic development and other roles you've played over your career that developing a mega site is very, very difficult. Even if you're trying to develop a 5-acre industrial site, it takes a lot of work to get the land, to make sure the land is usable for a mega site. People have a couple of hundred acres, Joe, and they think, well, oh, this would be a great industrial site. And then they find out there's a blue line stream and there's an easement and there's all kinds of things that are potentially wrong with that site. And so it was a long slog, but it paid off in the end, Joe, for sure.
Well, let's talk about Haywood County.
Okay.
Haywood County is a rural county in West Tennessee. Now, it is located along Interstate 40, but it's one of those counties that had lost population regularly for years and years and years, and it is very, very rural. Now, Mark, I've always been a big believer that you have to have collaboration, but you've got to have a leader.
That's right.
And somebody had to get this project started and have that vision of what might be, even though many times projects as large as this, you have to look at the long term of what might happen in the long term. You know, there was a local county mayor in Haywood County, Franklin Smith, and bless his soul, Franklin is no longer with us. But talk a little bit about how Franklin had the vision and how he really began this process of trying to put the land together to form this mega site.
Okay, so as part of the process when TVA was looking around their region at places that could potentially work, and you got to understand, Joe, that you got to have a lot of elements to be able to put a site like this together. One, they typically wanted to be primarily on an interstate, but if not on an interstate, very close to an interstate on a 4-lane highway that accessed an interstate. For a site this size and the investment that would have to take place, they wanted to be near rail. And then you also needed to have utilities nearby. So they went out and identified various locations around their 7 states. One of those sites was at exit 42 in Haywood County, where the Pilot truck stop is located. And so when they identified those sites around the 7-state region, they turned those sites and that information they had collected. They weren't going to pay to develop the sites. They weren't going to be the entity that went out and got the land. They turned it over to the local governments and said, hey, we've looked at this and we believe this could work as a mega site. And so Franklin got involved at that point. And then it was up to Franklin and his team to get the land, to actually get options on the land, which they got 4,200 acres, and that is huge. That's about the footprint of a lot of the smaller towns in West Tennessee. It is a huge area. It's 6 miles wide, to give you kind of an order of magnitude of how big the mega site is. And so
most of this is farmland at that time.
It was all farmland at that time. It was right there off the interstate north of the truck stop. So you would get off going toward Memphis, you'd take a right, and it was all that land from the interstate almost to Stanton, Tennessee. And so a huge footprint of land. And then it was up to the local governments to decide whether we want to take this on as a project or not, try to get options on the land to, eventually purchase the land, and then really put the plans together for how we would develop a site of this magnitude with the road infrastructure and the utility infrastructure it needed to serve something as large as Ford. And so that was a monumental task back 25 years ago. We're looking at around 2002 and 3 when the TVA did their process of identifying the sites in the 7-state region. And so at that point, Franklin took it over, and Michael Banks, who was the county attorney, it was really up to them to go out and get the options from, I think it was 40-plus different families.
And a lot of these owners did not live in the States.
That's correct. There were a lot of owners that lived, in California and around the country, and so they had to go out and identify every parcel of property within that footprint, and then it was up to them to go out and get options. Now, an option is where I pay you. You agree to let me take control of that property for a 2 or 3 or 4 year period of time, and then you agree more or less for me to pay you and you not sell it to anybody else during that time period. So they went out and negotiated with all those farmers for a very long time. And I got involved personally because in 2005, before they actually got the options on the mega site, TVA and the state wanted to go through a certification process. And what they look at in certifying an industrial site is does it have the elements that we talked about that you need? Is it close to that transportation infrastructure? Does it have potential to have the robust utilities that you need to have on that site to be able to serve some huge industrial user. And so I went through the process back then when I came to the Memphis Chamber in 2005. I partnered with Paul Latour, who was then the president of the Jackson-Madison County Chamber of Commerce. And we went through about an 18-month certification process with a company out of Greenville, South Carolina called McCallum Sweeney Consulting. And you know, Joe, as well as I do, back then they were one of the top companies in the country that helped big industries decide where to locate factories. They're called site selection consultants. And they were one of the top 5 site consultant firms in the country. So we went through that initial process of making sure that really all the elements were in place. Once that was finished is when they started trying to get options on the property. And so at that point, Michael Banks and Franklin Smith and others went out and started talking with the property owners. And that took quite a long time for them to be able to do it. And so it's an incredible story. I tell Michael he should write a book about acquiring the mega site because it is a really interesting and unique story that he tells about that. But a lot of the property owners at first didn't want to sell. And as you understand, back then, land was probably selling for $800 an acre, agricultural farmland at that point. And so there was really no way to tell how much we should pay for the property. You know, there were owners that didn't want to option the property. And so they spent quite a long period of time convincing these property owners that this would be good for the community. And really, it was always anticipated, and the concept behind that site was to be an automotive site. One of the reasons, if you remember, Joe, we had landed the 2 big car plants in Middle Tennessee. We'd landed Nissan first and then the Saturn plant in Spring Hill. Then we landed the Volkswagen plant. And so there had really not been that this was before Volkswagen, but we were seeing automotive facilities going up all around the South. And if you took a map of the southeastern United States, the one area where there's a big hole where there's no automotive production was in West Tennessee. And so TVA and the state brought in an automotive consultant, looked at the site, looked at where it was, looked at the workforce, looked at all the different parameters around what a car plant needs, and really blessed this as a great automotive assembly site. And so you should have Michael in at one of the podcasts to talk about it. But he tells one story about they had one farmer that was really reluctant to sell. Franklin finally convinced him to give an option on the property. They met him after 9 o'clock one night at a gas station in Brownsville. They got in his truck and he said, I'll sign your paper. He said, I'll take your check, but I'm not going to sign your paper. And Michael says, well, we can't give you the check unless you sign the paper. And Franklin said, give him the check. We'll get the paper signed later. And they did. But on that first round of options, which was a significant investment, the county didn't have enough money to actually pay for the options. They borrowed the money on that first round of options, and I think that was in 2007, if my memory serves.
And I think, didn't they borrow from a local bank?
They did. They borrowed the money from a local bank. And so during that period, Joe, we actually showed the mega site to some prospects. We showed it over the years, over the 15 years that I worked on it. We showed it to almost every automaker. We showed it to Nissan. We showed it to Tesla looked at the site. We had a lot of different automakers. Mazda looked at the site. So we had a lot of different companies that looked at it. But back then, they didn't own the property, and there was no infrastructure and really no plans for infrastructure at that point. But they did pay for the first round of options. They secured the property with the options, and then kind of things slowed down for a while. And then it came time for the second round of option payments. I think it was 2-year options that they had on the property. The county couldn't pay for it. They had not yet paid off the loan on the first round of options. So at that point, County Mayor Franklin Smith got with Matt Kisber, who was then the commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Economic Development, and said, would the state have any interest in helping us with this, to either help us with the options or actually take it over and purchase the site? And so Matt, knowing that Governor Bredesen at the time was a numbers guy and a data guy, went out and hired the University of Memphis's Bureau of Economic Research to do a study on what a 2,000 employee car plant would do for West Tennessee, what kind of impact it would have. And it was huge, Joe. Huge tax revenues, and this is back in 2007 or 8. A lot of employment, a lot of tax revenue, a lot of ancillary businesses that would follow something like this. You know, being in this business for so long, that the federal government every month does what's called the REM economic indicators, and that's the Regional Economic Modeling System. And they look at what any kind of individual job means in an economy. And an automotive assembly job, for every one automotive assembly job that's created, there are at least 7 other jobs that are created in the economy to support that job. Suppliers, raw materials, even things like restaurants and daycare and things like that that you have to have in place to support those types of jobs. And so he was able to convince Governor Bredesen back then to take on the mega site as a state project. And it was the only time in the state's history, is my understanding, that they actually decided to develop an industrial park.
So the key takeaway as far as the options are concerned, when the options matured, Haywood County government did not have the finances to purchase them themselves. All due diligence had been done by the local government. Then they go to state government. And this is where the collaborative part comes in, is that you had local government, state government, you brought in universities, you brought in consultants to really see if this was going to be feasible. And just, I guess, all the stars were aligned, and they were able to purchase the land.
They did. They started purchasing the land in 2009. They did put the second round of options out there, paid for that, and then in 2009, they decided they would go ahead and purchase the property. And one of the property owners at that time told them, "I'm not taking any less than $10,200 an acre for my property." And they said, "Well, you've just set the price for everybody." So that's what they paid. They paid over $40 million for that 4,200 acres of property out there and purchased it. So I think the purchases were complete in 2010. And then the real work began, because nothing happens in our world, Joe, without utilities, especially sewer infrastructure. And there was no sewer at the mega site, and the closest sewer system was about 15 miles away. So that's when the real work began on trying to figure out how we can put this utility infrastructure in at the mega site to be able to support a major industry.
Now, I know a lot of folks are not familiar with Haywood County, but Haywood County is a county of about 17,000 or so population. And actually, the closest municipality to the mega site is Stanton, Tennessee, with a population of around 500.
Correct.
So that gives you some picture of the rural area, the amount of money that had to be invested. So talk a little bit now about having to work through agencies for the infrastructure, because, as you said, you can have all the property you want, but if you don't have the infrastructure, you really don't have anything. And any company that looks at a site like that has to be assured that the infrastructure is going to be there.
That's right. And it really interesting in regards to the utilities, because the TVA had the electric side of it. So the TVA really, I can't think of a better economic development partner that a community could have anywhere in the country than TVA. They are consistent. They are always helpful. They are always there to help us recruit industry, to get sites for industry ready, to get our workforce prepared. And so they literally took over the responsibility of planning for the electricity. And so they didn't just plan, they bought easements. So the TVA had the electric piece, which was pretty easy in regards to the work being done. When it comes to the gas, the natural gas, they knew that they had gas to the south with the A&R pipeline. They knew they had gas to the west in Shelby County with Texas Gas. And so they knew they could get the gas over there pretty simply and pretty easily. It was just a matter of paying for the connections. Water, as you know, in our region is pretty simple as well. We sit on the second largest underground aquifer in the world, the Memphis Sands Aquifer. And so the plan pretty easily was put together that they would dig wells at the site, build water towers on the site, and have a water system on the mega site. The big issue for everybody was sewer. As you know, the regulations around sewer are incredibly difficult. Putting the clean water, the affluent that after it goes through the treatment process into a creek or a stream is very difficult. We have protected waterways like the Hatchie River, one of the last unchannelized, undisturbed natural water systems in the entire country. And so that's where it got really difficult is how are we, the nearest sewer plant was 15 miles away in Brownsville. How are we going to get sewer to the mega site? And so in late 2010, 2011, and another thing that you have to understand is there's a lot of politics that play into things like this. So you went from having an 8-year Democratic administration that in the last year of the governor's office, being in office, they purchased the mega site. Well, then in January of 2011, the Republican administration of Governor Haslam took over. So they inherited this 4,200 acre industrial site that the state had bought with no infrastructure. And so the initial plan, the original plan for sewer, Bill Hagerty, who's now our U.S. Senator, was the Commissioner of Economic Development. Their plan was to build a 15-mile pipeline to Brownsville. They were going to upgrade the Brownsville sewer system by tens of millions of dollars and pump that sewage from the mega site to Brownsville, treat that sewage in Brownsville at they have 2 treatment plants at both of the treatment plants. And then the original plan was for that affluent to go in the Forked Deer River. Well, they didn't have, TDEC had not allotted the capacity for Haywood County. A lot of that capacity was for Madison with all the population and other communities that use that. And so then the decision was made by the state to put that affluent into the Hatchie River. That's when things got dicey. So the state had they bought 15 miles worth of easement on the highway, Highway 70 from Stanton to Brownsville from the mega site. And they purchased 15 miles worth of sewer pipe. But when it got out into the public domain that they were going to put this affluent, which is effectively clean water, potable water, into the Hatchie River, the environmental groups in West Tennessee went crazy. They filed suits, they protested, and so for several years, from 2011 to maybe 2012 or 13, that was really tied up in the media and in the courts, and the decision was ultimately made to walk away from that plan of doing that improvement of the Brownsville sewer system. Now, it would have been an incredible thing for Haywood County because you ought to understand pumping the sewage from Stanton, which is 14, 15 miles from Brownsville on Highway 70, all of that 15 miles would have opened up for development. So you'd have had sewer access along the entire route of Highway 70 from Stanton to Brownsville, which would have meant anybody could have developed a business out there with sewer access, which you can't really have any kind of bigger commercial business without sewer. And so they walked away from that plan. Bill Hagerty left for another job. And then Randy Boyd, who's now the University of Tennessee president, took over as our commissioner. I think that was around 2014 or 15. And then their plan was to really bypass all of that and build a 36-mile pipeline from Stanton, Tennessee, effectively, to the Mississippi River, going through the western part of Haywood County and across all of Tipton County, from Mason, Tennessee, all the way up through Tipton County, through Covington, and then turning due west to go to the Mississippi River.
So now you've got to get all those easements.
Right. You've got to get all those easements. And not only easements, but permits, because you got to understand that when you start trying to put affluent into the Mississippi River, you go from working with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation to the U.S. Corps of Engineers. So you switch from a state agency where you might have a little influence over with some of your political leadership to a huge federal agency, the Corps of Engineers. And so we had to not only get all of the easements, which was hundreds of property owners, over 100, I think 120 unique property owners along that 36-mile route, which took forever. And there was a lot of, consternation by a lot of different people that it'll never happen. The property owners will sue us. They're not going to want to give up their property, which didn't happen ultimately. There were no lawsuits over those easements, and they were only pumping clean water because they're cleaning the sewage at the mega site, pumping the clean water under high pressure effectively from Stanton, that 36 miles. But you got to also understand that along that route, when you don't have gravity that can let the water flow downhill, you have to pump it. So everywhere you had to put in a pumping station, you had to get a permit, and then you had to wait and get the permit from the Corps of Engineers. The Corps of Engineer permit took 4 years, Joe, to get that permit to put that affluent in the Mississippi River. So we continued to show the site during that period, but not a lot of those site visits were, because we had a partnership where we worked with HTL Advantage, the Memphis Chamber, and the Jackson Chamber to show the site, because with only 17,000 people in Haywood County, you weren't going to put a 5,000 employee operation in a county that didn't have the workforce population or the amenities needed to be able to bring that many people to work at a facility like that. And so we had this partnership to where we worked together, but it really put the project on hold for a long, long time. And you can remember the day in 2019 when we got all that finished and we thought we were over the finish line, but we had some other hiccups after that.
Okay, as we end this program, I want our folks to take away how, number one, you've got to have a leader with a vision. And with that vision, you've got to see the long term. In today's world, and being a former elected official myself, we usually think in 4-year blocks. But I think everybody knew this was going to take longer than 4 years. Nobody knew it was going to take as long as
almost 20.
Almost 20 years.
Yeah.
But it took people working together, and as you mentioned, changes in administrations with the state, many times having to bring those folks up to speed on the project. And again, I think every time there was a change, we had to reinforce from the local people how important this was to rural West Tennessee.
That's true. And, not only, having a vision about the future and what this could mean for your area and your community, but it was taking the risk. There was a significant amount of risk that Franklin Smith and his people in Haywood County went through to be able to make this happen. And so, a lot of people think we coined a term called megasite fatigue over the years because people got so sick of hearing about the potential of the megasite, but nothing actually happening. So to go through that year after year after year is a difficult thing, and it takes a really special kind of leader to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Well, on today's podcast, we've talked about leaders with vision. We've talked about cooperation, collaboration. We've talked about how that you must have the faith to stay with a project. So now we've got the mega site. We figured out how to get the infrastructure to the site. And so we're going to end this podcast, and in our next podcast, we're going to talk with Mark about landing the big fish, about the recruitment of Ford Motor Company and SK Innovation, and the process that they went through, the people on the ground, and really it's just a very enlightening and interesting story. We appreciate you listening. Hope you'll listen to our next podcast, and we hope you enjoy our discussion. We do have an email address, and it's ruralstrong@gmail.com, and we would appreciate your comments, your suggestions, and if you have particular people or projects that you would like us to contact and feature on Rural Strong, we're happy to do that, and we love to hear from you. So with that, we appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to talking to Mark about the recruitment on our next podcast. Thanks for joining us on Rural Strong. If you found this helpful, share it and follow the show for more insights from rural leaders making a real difference. Until next time, stay rural strong.